So howdy folks, today I'm going to show you something a little bit different, and that's how to make one of these little mountain features. Now the cool thing about this is it actually doubles up as a nice warm white reading light in the evenings, and I've had quite a few people asking about it, so I thought I'd show you exactly how I made it. So let's jump straight in. Now you could make this for your home, but I actually installed this on our little camper here. So I was actually cutting the walls out beforehand with some 5mm thick plywood, and I needed to create the hole to then first accept the mountain feature. So I just took a plate to use this as a template. I think it was around about 30 centimeters wide in total. You can make it obviously whatever size you want, and I just drew around it, and then later on took a jigsaw to that outline and just cut out that hole. So a little later down the line, that wall was then installed and we had our hole ready to accept the feature itself, and you can probably see there is now a positive and negative cable just hanging down slightly at the bottom there, which is coming from our leisure battery. So I'll talk a little bit more about the wiring a little later on, but of course you just need to make sure there is a positive and negative cable running behind the walls at this point to where the feature is going to end up. Next I took some measurements and then I transferred them over to our material of choice for the backing board, and that material of choice was this bit of oak. That's a pretty beefy bit of oak. It's probably not something you would buy in a standard sort of hardware store. I actually went to visit my local timber merchants. Now what I'm basically doing is I'm taking those measurements onto that workpiece and I'm just finding the center point. The reason being is that we're going to use a little tool that's going to work alongside our router bit to basically center the router and get this perfect circular form. So you can probably see that extended arm there, and on the other end of it, it's got a little pin, and that kind of acts as the anchor. So I'm going to place that pin right in the very center of our workpiece, and then it's just going to allow me to pivot perfectly around that timber and get that lovely circular shape. So this timber is around about 30 to 35mm thick, which was just about the right thickness to accept 3 sort of layers of mountains, and I had to do sort of a handful of passes with the router in order to get right down to the bottom. But as you can see, once we'd finished going all the way around and we got to the bottom, you're kind of left with this wooden wheel of cheese almost. But I actually routed the very outer edge just to take off that very hard edge that existed, just kind of beveled it off to make it, you know, a little bit more pleasant to the eye. Now you can probably skip this next step if you've got lovely straight walls, but unfortunately we don't in this fan. You can see there's a slight curvature, and I'm just taking a compass and a pencil to scribe that curvature onto the edge of the backing board here. So what I'm hoping to do is get a really nice flush finish. So now you can see I've got a line on the side of the backing board. I'm going to take my router and I'm just going to very carefully sort of manually push it down, just eyeballing that line and trying to follow it as best as I possibly can. You can probably see that slight profile there, and now when I hold it up to the wall it's nice and flush. So again, I centered the router in the middle, and I brought the router in about 7 or 8 centimeters, worked all the way around the workpiece, and then gradually I was able to take out this much smaller sort of wooden wheel of cheese that then left us with this kind of porthole or ring that's going to act as the frame. So we're going to need a backing for that. So again, I've just glued some oak to the very back, let it dry overnight, and then I've come back with a router that's got a little bearing at the bottom, and that's enabled me to just route that nice and flush to that circular form. So you kind of ended up with this very shallow sort of top hat looking thing. So I gave it all a little bit of a sand, and then I created my design. So I used Photoshop for this, but you could just draw something on a piece of paper. I'll see if I can try and make the design I made available to download perhaps, so that you can use this exact one if you particularly liked it for any reason. And then I basically just printed it to size to fit within that frame itself. So then I grabbed some 3 contrasting timbers. So we've got some more oak, I've got some maple which has that lovely sort of blonde colour to it, and some American black walnut to contrast with a bit of a darker tone. Now each of the 3 timbers is going to need that curve in order for it to fit within the frame itself. So again, I've just centered the router bit and I've just added that curve onto the bottom of each workpiece. Now I'm going to cut out each of the 3 mountains. I'm going to apply some painter's tape onto each of the 3 timbers, spray on some glue, and then just press those sort of outlines onto it, which are then going to give me a little bit of an outline to follow with my scroll saw here. So this is called a scroll saw. You might have heard it being called a fret saw. It's basically like a smaller bandsaw, and it's great for cutting out these intricate shapes. My top tip is just to, take your time as you go, just enjoy it. The good thing about these sort of organic shapes is that if you do sort of stray a little bit, It doesn't matter too much because it is an organic shape after all. Once that's cut, you can then peel off that blue painter's tape, and the great thing is you won't be left with any of that spray glue residue on the timber itself to clean up. So you should see now you've got 3 mountains, but of course we're going to need to put our LED tape lights somewhere. So we're actually going to have a backing board that's going to sort of hold the LED tape lights behind each of the 3 mountains. I'm actually going to create an almost identical copy of each of those 3 mountains. They're just going to sit a little bit lower. So what this means is the LED light will actually sit on the very ridge, but because they're a little bit lower, you won't be able to actually see them in plain view. So again, I'll take that over to the scroll saw, I'll cut them out. Just for reference, each of these timbers are all about 4mm thick. So they're very thin. You can kind of see what it's going to look like when it's all layered up. So you're going to have that backing board which is going to have the ridge on, then a mountain on the top that sits just a little bit higher, and same again. Before we adhere everything, I'm going to apply some finish, just while it's a little bit easier at this time. So I'm using some Danish oil, you could use some wax or whatever finish takes your fancy. Now let's take a look at the actual LED tape lights themselves. Now these are super thin, these ones. They're only about 4mm thick. I'll see if I can actually find the original ones that I bought and leave them in the description, because these are ideal for allowing maximum depth within the actual frame itself. So basically I'm just running it across the ridge here of one of the backing boards just to gauge what length it should be. I'm just then cutting it to size, and then I'm grabbing some 12-volt cable. So for this I'm using what's called twin core. It means it's got a positive and a negative side to the cable. It will have a outer layer of insulation, which I'm just stripping back, and then both the positive and negative cable will have insulation on. And I'm just using an automatic wire stripper, which is a fantastic little tool to just strip the very end pieces of insulation off. So I'm actually going to solder the cable to the tape lights. You'll see that there's 2 little copper conductors on the tape lights. You might need to just strip back a little bit of that sort of clear insulation that it has in order to make those conductors available. But I'm basically just going to apply some flux to both the conductors and to both the wires. Then I'm going to pop them in this little help me tool. I can't remember what it's called, help me mate or a handy mate, I can't remember what they call it. But basically it's just going to hold the cable and the LED strip light. And then I'm going to take some solder and I'm just going to solder the 2 wires onto the 2 conductors. So each mountain will have a tape light behind it, and each tape light is going to have 1 positive and 1 negative coming from it. Now one tip I would give is if you can get hold of a really fine soldering tip, that would be really useful. So once you're happy, you can actually then go and press the LED tape light onto the ridge itself. There is a backing that you can pull off the back of these tape lights, and then you can just press that onto the ridge, but I didn't find it was that strong, so I did actually apply some glue just to ensure that this had some longevity to it. So our cables are going to need somewhere to go, so I'm just sort of roughly gauging where I want this hole to go, and then I'm going to drill a little hole that's going to allow all of those cables to basically pass through. And once that's done, it's basically just a case of gluing each of the layers up. So obviously the backing board goes in first, and then your first little mountain design, and then you do the second and the third, or however many you're planning on putting in. And I also added a little moon at the very top. I just thought that'd be quite cool, but that was quite tight, just wrapping the cabling around that. And there we have it. That's kind of what it looks like, and I think it looks quite cool just as it is without the light on, but now it's just basically a case of actually sorting the wiring out. So just to kind of simplify this as much as possible, I've basically wired this in parallel. So what that actually means is there's a positive and a negative cable that's coming from the battery. And what we're going to do is we're going to take every positive cable that's coming from each of those 4 LED lights, and we're going to attach it to that 1 positive that's coming from the battery. Same with the negatives. There'll be 4 negative cables now coming out of the back of our feature, and I'm going to then attach that to the 1 negative that's coming from the battery. Now this is called wiring in parallel rather than wiring series. The good thing about this is that if one of the LED tape lights fail, the others will continue to work. Now I'm just crimping all of these wires together. This is kind of what it turned out like.
Okay, here we go.
Whoa, that looks so cool.
Look alright?
Yeah, it looks amazing.
So I probably set the tape lights around about 2 or 3 centimeters below the ridge of each of the mountains, which is probably just enough so that you didn't see the tape lights in plain view, but probably just high enough that you got this feeling of perhaps like a late sunset just sitting behind the mountains. So I'm now just connecting that feature up to that positive and negative cable that's coming from the battery. As you can see, I've just taped off all of the cables so that they're not loose and moving around lots when the van's in motion. And once I'm happy with that, I can then go and adhere it on. Now you could use wood glue by all means. I actually used some adhesive that had a lot more grab to it. Obviously this is on a wall, so it was really handy that it was able to almost self-support itself. Then I just took this stand from the washing line and kind of made a makeshift means of kind of pushing it in place and holding it there whilst it all set. Anyway, that's basically it. This is what it looks like when it's all said and done. But I hope this was helpful to someone anyway. Give us a like if it was, and let us know if you've got any questions. Just add them into the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. And hopefully we'll catch you on another video soon.